I never thought the words, "You're already dead to me," would become the catalyst for the most calculated revenge of my lifetime. Standing in that sterile conference room, watching Marcus Thompson lean back in his leather chair with that smug smile, I'd grown to despise. I felt something inside me shift permanently. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he delivered what he thought was my professional death sentence, his voice dripping with the kind of arrogance that only comes from a man who's never faced real consequences for his actions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "Let's be honest, Rebecca," he said, adjusting his expensive cufflinks while the other board members avoided eye contact. "Your ideas are outdated, your performance has been declining, and frankly, you're already in your grave career-wise. This company needs fresh blood, not yesterday's news clinging to relevance." The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic from 30 floors below. I could feel the eyes of my colleagues burning into me, some with pity, others with the uncomfortable relief that comes from watching someone else's execution. Marcus continued his theatrical performance, clearly enjoying every moment of what he believed was my complete destruction. But what Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had spent the last 6 months meticulously documenting every illegal move, every unethical decision, and every corner he'd cut to climb his way to the top. While he thought he was burying me, I was actually digging his financial grave, and I was about to bury his future 6 feet under. My name is Rebecca Chen, and this is the story of how I transformed from a respected financial analyst into what some would call a corporate assassin. It wasn't a role I ever imagined for myself, but sometimes life forces you to become someone you never thought you could be. Sometimes the only way to survive is to ensure your enemy doesn't. I had joined Meridian Financial Group 8 years earlier, fresh out of graduate school with an MBA from Wharton and dreams of revolutionizing the investment world. The company was smaller then, more intimate, with a culture that actually valued innovation and ethical practices. I started as a junior analyst working 16-hour days and surviving on coffee and determination, but I was passionate about what I did. I believed in the power of smart investments to change lives, to build futures, to create something meaningful. Those early years were golden. I quickly distinguished myself by identifying undervalued tech companies before they exploded, saving the firm millions while generating unprecedented returns for our clients. My research was thorough, my instincts sharp, and my commitment unwavering. By my 3rd year, I had been promoted to senior analyst. By my 5th, I was leading my own team. My colleagues respected me, clients requested me specifically, and I thought I had found my forever home in the corporate world. That was before Marcus Thompson arrived like a tornado in an expensive suit. Marcus had been recruited from Goldman Sachs with great fanfare, bringing what the board called aggressive growth strategies and cutting-edge market insights. From the moment he walked through our doors, everything began to change. He was charming in that dangerous way that some men perfect, with silver hair that was always perfectly styled, a smile that never quite reached his eyes, and the ability to make you feel like the most important person in the room while simultaneously planning your destruction. Initially, I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. Change was inevitable in our industry, and fresh perspectives could be valuable. I even volunteered to collaborate with him on several projects, thinking that my experience combined with his connections could create something powerful. For a brief moment, it seemed like we might actually work well together. The first red flag came during a client presentation about 3 months after his arrival. We were pitching a conservative portfolio strategy to the Peterson Foundation, a nonprofit that managed funds for children's hospitals across the country. The foundation's board was extremely risk-averse, having been burned by aggressive strategies in the past, and they had specifically requested stable, long-term growth options. I had spent weeks crafting a presentation that balanced growth potential with security, focusing on blue-chip stocks, government bonds, and carefully vetted municipal investments. The strategy would have generated steady returns while protecting the foundation's principal, exactly what they needed to ensure consistent funding for their medical programs. Marcus sat through my entire presentation with what I thought was attentive interest, nodding occasionally and asking thoughtful questions. Then, just as I was concluding, he stood up and completely redirected the conversation. Rebecca's approach is certainly conservative, he said with that practiced smile. But I think we're missing an incredible opportunity here. The Peterson Foundation doesn't need safe investments. They need transformative ones. What followed was a 40-minute pitch for high-risk cryptocurrency ventures, volatile biotech startups, and derivative trading strategies that would have made a hedge fund manager nervous. The foundation board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Marcus painted pictures of massive returns and revolutionary breakthroughs, completely ignoring their stated preference for stability. I watched in horror as he systematically dismantled everything I had built with the Peterson Foundation over 2 years of relationship building. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet to me. These were real children who needed surgeries, real families facing medical crises, real doctors trying to save lives with limited resources. Mr. Thompson, Dr. Sarah Winters, the Foundation's chairwoman, interrupted politely but firmly. We appreciate your enthusiasm, but we've been very clear about our risk tolerance. We simply cannot afford to gamble with funds that directly impact children's medical care. Marcus's smile never wavered, but I caught a flash of something cold in his eyes. Of course, Dr. Winters, I understand your position completely, but perhaps you're not seeing the bigger picture here. With the right strategy, you could double or even triple your funding capacity. Think about how many more children you could help. We could also lose everything and help no one, Dr. Winters replied, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen real consequences. We'll need some time to discuss this internally. The meeting ended awkwardly, with the foundation board clearly uncomfortable and Marcus acting as if everything had gone perfectly. As we packed up our materials, I tried to address the elephant in the room. Marcus, we should probably prepare a revised presentation that addresses their concerns about risk, I suggested carefully. I know these people, and they're not going to change their fundamental approach because of one meeting. He looked at me with an expression I would later recognize as the look of a predator sizing up its prey. Rebecca, I appreciate your input, but I think you might be too close to this situation to see it objectively. Sometimes clients need to be educated about what they actually need, not just given what they think they want. 3 weeks later, the Peterson Foundation chose a different firm for their investment management. 2 years of relationship building, gone. Months of trust and credibility, destroyed. When I asked Marcus how he planned to explain the loss to our senior partners, he shrugged with casual indifference. Win some, lose some, he said. Besides, they weren't really our kind of client anyway. Too risk-averse, too small thinking. We need to focus on bigger opportunities. That's when I began to understand that Marcus and I had fundamentally different definitions of success. For me, success meant building lasting relationships, generating consistent returns, and helping clients achieve their actual goals. For Marcus, success was about the size of the deal, the drama of the pitch, and the immediate gratification of appearing brilliant, regardless of the long-term consequences. The Peterson Foundation incident was just the beginning. Over the following months, I watched Marcus systematically alienate long-term clients, push through risky investments that I knew were doomed to fail, and create an atmosphere of fear and competition within our team. He had a particular talent for taking credit for successful projects while ensuring that any failures could be traced back to other people's inadequate execution of his visionary strategies. What made it worse was how effective he was at managing up. Senior partners who had known and trusted me for years began questioning my judgment after carefully orchestrated conversations with Marcus. He never directly criticized me in public, which would have been too obvious. Instead, he used subtle implications, strategic omissions, and carefully timed expressions of concern. "I hope Rebecca is doing okay," he'd say to our managing partner, James Morrison, with just the right amount of worry in his voice. "She seems to be struggling with some of the more complex strategies we're implementing. I'm trying to mentor her through it, but you know how challenging it can be when people get set in their ways." James had hired me personally and had always been supportive of my career, but I could see Marcus's poison working. Suddenly, my project proposals were getting more scrutiny. My client interactions were being monitored more closely. My professional judgment, which had been trusted for years, was constantly being second-guessed. The breaking point came 8 months after Marcus's arrival, during the quarterly review meeting that would ultimately change everything. I had been tracking the performance of our entire portfolio, and the numbers were deeply troubling. Several of Marcus's high-risk investments were hemorrhaging money, while the stable strategies I had recommended were performing exactly as projected. I had prepared a comprehensive analysis showing that our firm's overall returns had actually decreased since Marcus's arrival, despite his claims of revolutionary improvements. The data was irrefutable. We were taking bigger risks for smaller returns, alienating long-term clients, and building a reputation for unreliability in the market. I spent weeks preparing my presentation, knowing this would be my chance to demonstrate the real impact of the changes Marcus had implemented. I included client feedback, performance metrics, and detailed projections showing where we were headed if we continued on our current path. It wasn't personal, it was just math. Numbers don't lie, and these numbers told a story of steady decline disguised as innovation. The morning of the presentation, I felt confident but nervous. I knew the data supported my position, but I also knew that Marcus had spent months building relationships and managing perceptions. Still, I believed that facts would speak for themselves, that rational business people would make rational decisions when presented with clear evidence. The conference room was packed with senior partners, department heads, and key stakeholders. Marcus sat directly across from me, his expression friendly and encouraging, as if he was genuinely interested in what I had to say. Looking back, I should have recognized that expression for what it was: the calm confidence of someone who knows they hold all the cards. I began my presentation methodically, walking through our historical performance, then showing the dramatic shift that had occurred over the past 8 months. I highlighted specific investments, client relationships, and market positions, carefully explaining how each data point connected to our overall trajectory. The room was initially engaged, with several partners asking thoughtful questions and requesting clarification on various metrics. I could see some heads nodding as the implications of the data became clear. For a moment, I thought I was actually getting through to them. Then Marcus asked to respond. "First, let me say how much I appreciate Rebecca's thorough analysis," he began, his voice warm and respectful. "This kind of detailed review is exactly what we need to stay competitive." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. However, I think there might be some context missing from these numbers that could help us understand the full picture. What followed was a masterclass in manipulation. Marcus didn't dispute my data. Instead, he reframed it entirely. Short-term volatility became necessary growing pains. Client departures became strategic positioning for higher-value relationships. Decreased returns became investments in future growth potential. But the most devastating part of his response was how he positioned my analysis itself. Without ever directly attacking me, he managed to paint my presentation as evidence of outdated thinking, resistance to change, and failure to understand modern market dynamics. "I want to be clear that I have tremendous respect for Rebecca's experience and dedication," he said, his voice carrying just the right amount of regret. "She's been an invaluable part of this organization for many years, but I think what we're seeing here is a classic example of how hard it can be to adapt when industries evolve." He pulled out his own presentation, which I had never seen before, full of cherry-picked data points and projections that painted a completely different picture. Where I had shown 8 months of decline, he showed potential for exponential growth. Where I had highlighted client concerns, he presented testimonials from new prospects. Where I had demonstrated risk, he illustrated opportunity. The most painful part was watching my colleagues' expressions change as Marcus spoke. These were people I had worked with for years, people who had trusted my judgment on countless occasions, and I could see them being swayed by his confidence and charisma. "The reality is," Marcus continued, building to his conclusion, "that Rebecca's approach, while admirable in its conservatism, simply isn't compatible with where this industry is heading. We can't afford to be left behind because we're too afraid to take the risks necessary for real growth." When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then James Morrison, my former mentor and advocate, asked the question that I knew would determine my future at Meridian Financial. "Rebecca, how do you respond to Marcus's analysis? Do you think your concerns might be overly cautious given the potential Marcus has outlined?" I looked around the room at faces I had known for years, people I had considered friends and allies, and I realized that the decision had already been made before I ever walked into that conference room. Marcus hadn't just prepared a presentation. He had prepared the ground, shaped the narrative, and ensured that my data would be viewed through the lens he had carefully constructed. Still, I tried one more time to make my case based purely on facts. "The numbers speak for themselves," I said, my voice steady despite the growing dread in my chest. "We can project all the growth we want, but our actual performance has declined measurably since we shifted strategies. Our client satisfaction scores are down, our retention rates are dropping, and our risk-adjusted returns are the lowest they've been in 5 years." "But Rebecca?" Marcus interrupted gently. "Aren't you essentially arguing for stagnation? Yes, we might have some short-term volatility, but that's the price of positioning ourselves for the future. Sometimes you have to be willing to disrupt your own comfort zone to achieve real success." That's when I realized I was fighting a battle I couldn't win with traditional weapons. Marcus wasn't interested in facts or performance or client satisfaction. He was playing a completely different game, one where perception mattered more than reality, where confidence trumped competence, and where the ability to sell a story was more valuable than the ability to deliver results. The meeting concluded with what James called a constructive discussion about strategic direction, but I could read between the lines. My analysis had been noted and filed away, while Marcus's vision had been embraced as the path forward. Over the following weeks, I watched my role gradually diminish as Marcus consolidated power and influence. Projects I had been leading were reassigned to his team members. Clients I had developed relationships with were transferred to his oversight. Meetings I had always attended were suddenly happening without me, with the explanation that they were focusing on forward-looking strategies that might not align with my expertise. The final insult came 3 months later, when the quarterly performance reports were released. Despite the concerning trends I had identified, Marcus had managed to manipulate the presentation of data to make his initiatives appear successful. Losses were characterized as strategic investments. Client departures were described as portfolio optimization, and the overall decline in performance was attributed to market-wide volatility rather than poor decision-making. But I had access to the real numbers, the unfiltered data that told the true story of what was happening to our firm. And that's when I began to formulate my plan. I started staying late at the office, not to work on current projects, but to dig deeper into Marcus's background and business practices. I began documenting every questionable decision, every client interaction that raised red flags, every instance where his public statements didn't match the private reality. What I discovered was even worse than I had suspected. Marcus hadn't just been making risky investments. He had been actively manipulating data, misrepresenting client positions, and engaging in practices that were not just unethical, but potentially illegal. He had been covering his tracks well, using his charm and influence to deflect scrutiny, but the evidence was there if you knew where to look. The more I investigated, the more I realized that Marcus's entire career had been built on a foundation of deception and manipulation. His success at Goldman Sachs hadn't been due to brilliant strategies. It had been due to his ability to take credit for other people's work while avoiding responsibility for his own failures. He was essentially a professional parasite, moving from firm to firm, extracting what value he could before the inevitable collapse. But this time would be different. This time, he had made the mistake of targeting someone who understood both the financial industry and the power of information. Someone who had spent years building relationships and establishing credibility. Someone who had access to the kind of detailed data that could expose his entire operation. As I sat in my office late one evening, reviewing the mountain of evidence I had compiled, I made a decision that would change everything. Marcus thought he had buried my career, but he had actually given me the motivation and justification I needed to bury his entire financial future. The irony was perfect. He had used my own thoroughness and attention to detail against me, but those same qualities would become the weapons I used to destroy him. Every document I had meticulously filed, every relationship I had carefully maintained, every piece of knowledge I had accumulated over 8 years at Meridian Financial would become part of my strategy to ensure that Marcus Thompson's reputation, career, and financial security were buried so deep that he would never recover. But I knew I had to be patient. Rushing into action would only give him the opportunity to use his influence and connections to deflect blame and minimize consequences. Instead, I would need to plan carefully, building an airtight case that left no room for manipulation or escape. That night, as I walked through the empty office corridors toward the elevator, I passed Marcus's corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive artwork. The lights were off, but I could see his silhouette against the city skyline, working late as always, probably planning his next move in what he thought was his inevitable rise to power. He had no idea that across the hall, in my smaller, more modest office, I had already begun planning his destruction. He thought he had won, thought he had eliminated the only person who could challenge his authority and expose his deceptions. But Marcus Thompson was about to learn that underestimating Rebecca Chen was the biggest mistake of his professional life. He had told me I was already in my grave, but he was about to discover that I was very much alive, and I was coming for everything he had built on lies and manipulation. The war between us had been declared the moment he tried to bury my career, but the battle was just beginning, and I intended to win. The next 6 months of my life became a careful dance between maintaining my professional facade while systematically building the foundation for Marcus's downfall. Every morning, I would arrive at the office with a smile, exchange pleasantries with colleagues, and perform my increasingly diminished duties with the same dedication I had always shown. But beneath the surface, I was conducting the most important investigation of my career. I started by creating what I called my shadow filing system. For every official document that crossed my desk, every email thread I was included on, every meeting I attended where Marcus was present, I created detailed backup copies that were stored in multiple secure locations. I opened several encrypted cloud storage accounts under different names, purchased external hard drives that I kept in a safety deposit box, and even maintained physical copies of the most damaging documents in a locked filing cabinet at my apartment. The beauty of working in financial services was that everything left a paper trail. Every transaction, every client communication, every internal memo created a permanent record that could be traced and verified. Marcus was brilliant at manipulating perceptions and controlling narratives, but he couldn't change the fundamental facts embedded in our database systems and compliance records. My first major breakthrough came when I discovered discrepancies in the client reporting for the Hartwell Pension Fund, a $200 million account that Marcus had personally taken over from my team. The pension fund represented the retirement savings of thousands of municipal employees, teachers, and firefighters who had trusted us with their financial futures. It was exactly the kind of conservative, stability-focused account that Marcus typically dismissed as uninteresting. According to the monthly reports that Marcus was sending to the pension fund administrators, their portfolio was performing exceptionally well, with steady growth and minimal volatility. The reports showed a carefully balanced mix of government, bonds, blue-chip stocks, and high-grade corporate debt that aligned perfectly with their risk tolerance and investment objectives. However, when I accessed the actual trading records through my administrative privileges, a completely different picture emerged. Marcus had been systematically moving the pension fund's money into highly speculative investments, including cryptocurrency, futures, biotech startups, and leveraged commodity trades. The stable bonds and conservative stocks listed in the reports existed only on paper. What made this discovery even more alarming was the sophisticated way Marcus had hidden these unauthorized trades. He had created a complex web of intermediate accounts and shell companies that made it nearly impossible to trace the money flow without deep technical knowledge of our systems. To any casual observer, including the pension fund's own auditors, everything appeared legitimate and properly diversified. But the real numbers told a horrifying story. The pension fund had already lost nearly 15% of its value due to Marcus's unauthorized speculation, losses that were being masked by fictitious performance reports and accounting manipulation. Thousands of people who had worked there, entire careers believing their retirements were secure, were actually facing potential financial devastation, and they had no idea. I spent weeks verifying my findings, cross-referencing trading records with compliance databases and client agreements. Every additional layer of investigation revealed new evidence of Marcus's deception and confirmed the scope of what he was doing. This wasn't just aggressive investment strategy or questionable judgment. This was outright fraud. The Hartwell Pension Fund wasn't an isolated case. As I expanded my investigation, I discovered similar patterns across multiple client accounts. Marcus had been systematically moving money from conservative portfolios into high-risk investments while maintaining the fiction of stability and safety in his client communications. He was essentially gambling with other people's life savings, while making it appear that he was the most successful portfolio manager in the firm's history. The psychological profile of what Marcus was doing became clearer as I dug deeper. He wasn't just trying to generate impressive returns. He was feeding an addiction to risk and excitement that required constantly escalating stakes. Each successful gamble emboldened him to take bigger risks with more money, while each loss motivated him to double down in increasingly desperate attempts to recover. What made his scheme particularly insidious was how he had structured the timing of his deceptions. Most of his unauthorized high-risk investments were in positions that wouldn't fully mature or be easily discovered for months or even years. He was betting that he could generate enough short-term gains to cover his long-term losses before anyone noticed the substitution. But Marcus had made a critical error in his calculations. He had assumed that the financial markets would continue to rise indefinitely, allowing him to profit from his unauthorized speculation while maintaining the illusion of conservative management. What he hadn't anticipated was the sector-wide downturn that began hitting technology and cryptocurrency markets just as I was uncovering his activities. The irony was perfect. Marcus's own greed and recklessness were creating the exact conditions that would expose his fraud and destroy his carefully constructed reputation. Every day that the markets declined was another day that his unauthorized positions lost value and moved him closer to inevitable discovery. I realized that I didn't need to actively destroy Marcus. I just needed to ensure that his own crimes were properly documented and reported when they inevitably came to light. My role wasn't to be his executioner, but rather his chronicler, carefully recording every detail of his downfall for posterity. This shift in perspective changed my entire approach to gathering evidence. Instead of looking for ways to attack Marcus directly, I focused on creating an unassailable record of his activities that would protect the innocent people whose money he was gambling away. I began reaching out to some of my former clients, not to expose Marcus immediately, but to subtly encourage them to request detailed portfolio reviews and performance audits. Dr. Patricia Yamamoto, who managed investments for a children's medical research foundation, was one of the first to respond to my carefully worded suggestions. I had worked with her foundation for over 3 years, helping them build a conservative portfolio designed to provide steady income for their research grants and patient support programs. During a casual lunch meeting, I mentioned that the current market volatility might be a good time for her foundation to conduct a comprehensive review of their holdings. I didn't mention Marcus specifically or make any accusations, but I did suggest that they might want to verify that their actual investments matched the allocations described in their monthly reports. Dr. Yamamoto was a brilliant scientist, but had limited financial expertise, so she trusted our firm to manage the technical details of her foundation's investments. However, she was also naturally cautious and had a deep sense of responsibility to the children and families who depended on her foundation's support. 3 weeks later, she called me with concerns about discrepancies she had discovered during her review. The independent audit she had commissioned showed significant differences between the conservative portfolio she had requested and the actual investments being made with her foundation's money. I listened to her describe the findings with a mixture of professional outrage and personal satisfaction. Marcus had taken money that was supposed to be invested in stable government bonds and had instead put it into speculative biotech companies that existed only on paper. Money that should have been supporting cutting-edge research into childhood diseases was instead funding Marcus's gambling addiction. The conversation with Dr. Yamamoto was a turning point for me. Until that moment, my investigation had been primarily about professional vindication and personal revenge. But hearing the genuine fear and disappointment in her voice as she described the potential impact on sick children made me realize that this was about much more than my own wounded pride. Marcus wasn't just destroying my career. He was destroying the financial security of teachers, firefighters, medical researchers, and countless other people who had trusted our firm with their futures. Every dollar he lost through unauthorized speculation was a dollar that wouldn't be available for someone's retirement, someone's education, or someone's medical treatment. That realization transformed my investigation from a personal vendetta into a moral crusade. I wasn't just gathering evidence to protect myself or to get revenge against Marcus. I was building a case to protect innocent people from a financial predator who was systematically stealing their futures. Over the following months, I expanded my network of concerned clients and professional contacts, always being careful to remain subtle and indirect in my communications. I never made direct accusations against Marcus or revealed the full scope of what I had discovered. Instead, I simply encouraged people to ask questions, request audits, and verify that their investments matched their expectations. The response was overwhelming. Client after client began discovering discrepancies between what they had been told and what was actually happening with their money. Each new revelation added another piece to the puzzle and provided additional confirmation of Marcus's systematic fraud. Meanwhile, at the office, Marcus's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic as the market downturn continued to expose his unauthorized positions. I watched him go from confident and arrogant to stressed and defensive, though he was still managing to maintain his public facade of success and control. The pressure was clearly getting to him. He started working even longer hours, arriving at the office before dawn and staying until well after midnight. His expensive suits looked rumpled, his perfect hair was often disheveled, and his famous charm was beginning to crack under the strain of maintaining multiple layers of deception. I found myself in the unique position of watching a master manipulator slowly lose control of his own game. Marcus had built his entire career on his ability to manage perceptions and control narratives, but the mathematical reality of market losses and client demands for transparency was creating problems that couldn't be solved through charisma and misdirection. The most satisfying part was that Marcus still had no idea I was the source of his mounting problems. To him, I was just another casualty of his corporate takeover, relegated to minor administrative tasks and excluded from important decisions. He saw me as defeated and irrelevant, which made me effectively invisible as I continued to document his crimes and coordinate with his victims. My daily routine became a carefully choreographed performance. Each morning, I would arrive at the office and spend the first hour reviewing overnight market movements and their impact on Marcus's unauthorized positions. I maintained detailed spreadsheets tracking the growing losses across all of his manipulated accounts, calculating the total damage to client portfolios and the increasing likelihood of discovery. During regular business hours, I performed my assigned duties with professional competence while staying alert for any new information about Marcus's activities. I attended meetings where he continued to present false performance reports, participated in client calls where he repeated lies about portfolio composition, and watched him manipulate data to hide the mounting evidence of his fraud. But the most important work happened after hours, when the office was empty and I could safely access the database systems and compliance records that contained the proof of Marcus's crimes. I would methodically copy documents, cross-reference, transaction records, and build increasingly detailed timelines of his unauthorized activities. The evidence I was accumulating was overwhelming in both quantity and quality. I had documented over $50 million in unauthorized trades across dozens of client accounts. I had recorded hundreds of instances where Marcus's client communications directly contradicted the actual investment activities. I had identified patterns of systematic deception that stretched back over months and affected nearly every major account under his management. But I knew that having evidence wasn't enough. I needed to ensure that the evidence would be seen by the right people at the right time to maximize its impact. This required careful timing and strategic thinking about how to present my findings, in a way that would be impossible to ignore or discredit. I began reaching out to regulatory contacts and former colleagues who had moved to other firms, not to blow the whistle immediately, but to build relationships and establish credibility for when the time came to present my case. I attended industry conferences and professional networking events, always maintaining my reputation as a competent and ethical financial professional. The goal was to ensure that when Marcus's house of cards finally collapsed, I would be positioned as a credible source of information rather than a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind. I needed people to see me as someone who had discovered fraud and reported it responsibly, not as someone who had orchestrated a colleague's destruction out of personal animosity. This long-term approach required tremendous patience and self-control. Every day, I watched Marcus continue to defraud innocent clients while knowing that I had the power to stop him immediately. The temptation to expose everything at once was enormous, but I knew that premature action would give him the opportunity to cover his tracks and deflect blame onto others. The breakthrough came when one of Marcus's high-risk cryptocurrency investments suffered a catastrophic collapse. A blockchain company that he had invested heavily in across multiple client accounts was revealed to be an elaborate Ponzi scheme, losing 95% of its value overnight when the fraud was exposed by federal investigators. The loss was so large and so sudden that Marcus couldn't hide it through his usual accounting manipulation. Client portfolios that were supposed to be invested in conservative government bonds suddenly showed massive losses that couldn't be explained by normal market volatility. I watched Marcus panic as he tried to manage the crisis, calling emergency meetings with senior partners and frantically working to develop explanations for the unexplainable losses. For the first time since I had known him, his confidence was completely shattered, and his usual smooth talking points were replaced by stammering attempts at damage control. The beautiful irony was that Marcus's own greed had created the exact situation that would expose his entire operation. He had invested so heavily in the fraudulent cryptocurrency company precisely because it had been generating the enormous returns he needed to cover his other unauthorized losses. When it collapsed, it created a hole so large that all of his other deceptions became visible. Senior partners who had been charmed by Marcus's previous explanations suddenly found themselves asking harder questions about portfolio performance and risk management. Clients who had been satisfied with their monthly reports began demanding real-time access to their account information. Regulatory compliance officers who had accepted Marcus's documentation at face value started conducting more thorough audits. I knew that this was the moment I had been preparing for. Marcus's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and the evidence I had been gathering for months would soon become the foundation for a comprehensive investigation into his activities. But I also knew that Marcus was dangerous when cornered. His entire identity was built on his reputation for success and sophistication, and the exposure of his fraud would destroy everything he had worked to build. I needed to be prepared for him to strike back with whatever weapons he had available. The next phase of my plan would require even more careful execution than the investigation phase. I would need to present my evidence in a way that protected innocent clients, ensured proper legal consequences for Marcus, and minimized any potential retaliation against me or others who had been victimized by his schemes. As I sat in my office that evening, reviewing the mountain of evidence I had compiled, I felt a mixture of anticipation and trepidation about what was coming next. Marcus had tried to bury my career, but instead he had awakened something in me that he was completely unprepared to handle. The man who had confidently declared that I was already in my grave was about to discover that I had spent months digging his financial tomb. And unlike his victims, I had chosen my burial ground very carefully. The morning Marcus walked into my office unannounced, I knew the game had fundamentally changed. It was barely 7 a.m, and I was reviewing the latest batch of compliance reports when his shadow fell across my desk. He stood in my doorway wearing a wrinkled shirt and an expression I had never seen before, something between desperation and rage. "We need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. Without invitation, the confident swagger that had defined his presence for months was completely gone, replaced by the tense energy of someone who knew their world was collapsing but couldn't quite understand why. I looked up from my computer screen with what I hoped appeared to be mild curiosity rather than the surge of adrenaline that was actually coursing through my veins. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the confrontation that would determine whether my months of careful planning would pay off, or whether Marcus would find a way to turn the situation to his advantage. "Of course, Marcus. What can I help you with?" I kept my voice neutral and professional, as if his obvious distress was just another routine workplace interaction. He moved closer to my desk, his usual respect for personal space abandoned in favor of intimidation tactics. "Don't play games with me, Rebecca. I know what you've been doing." The accusation hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that neither of us was quite ready to make explicit. I maintained eye contact while mentally reviewing the security measures I had put in place to protect my evidence and ensure my own safety. "I'm not sure what you mean," I replied calmly. "I've been performing my assigned duties and managing my reduced responsibilities as directed by senior management." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Your assigned duties, right. Is that what you call encouraging clients to audit their portfolios? Is that what you call suggesting they hire independent analysts to verify their holdings?" So he had figured out the source of his mounting problems. I felt a mixture of satisfaction that my strategy had been effective and concern about what his next move might be. Marcus was unpredictable when he felt cornered, and I needed to be careful not to push him into doing something that could hurt innocent people. "Marcus, if clients are asking questions about their investments, that's probably because they have legitimate concerns about portfolio performance. Market volatility has been significant lately, and prudent investors naturally want to understand how their holdings are being affected. He slammed his hand down on my desk, causing my coffee cup to jump and spill across some papers. The violent gesture was so unexpected and out of character that it revealed just how much pressure he was under. Cut the innocent act, Rebecca. I know you've been systematically turning my clients against me. Dr. Yamamoto, the Hartwell Pension Fund, the Morrison Family Trust, they all started asking detailed questions about their portfolios right after having conversations with you. I reached for some tissues to clean up the spilled coffee, using the moment to compose my response. It was important not to deny his accusations too strenuously, which would seem dishonest, but also not to admit to anything that could be used against me later. I've maintained professional relationships with many clients over my years here. When they ask for advice about financial planning or express concerns about market conditions, I try to provide helpful guidance. That's part of building trust and ensuring client satisfaction. Helpful guidance, Marcus repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Like suggesting they verify that their actual holdings match their monthly statements? Like recommending they conduct surprise audits of their account activity? The specificity of his knowledge about my conversations with clients was concerning. It suggested that he had been monitoring my communications more closely than I had realized, which raised questions about what other surveillance he might have been conducting. Marcus, I think you're overestimating my influence here. I've been marginalized within this organization for months. I hardly think I have the power to orchestrate some kind of conspiracy against you. This was a calculated response designed to remind him of his own role in diminishing my position, while also suggesting that his paranoia might be unfounded. I wanted him to question whether his problems were really due to my actions or whether they might have other causes. But Marcus wasn't buying my attempt at misdirection. He had clearly spent considerable time analyzing the pattern of client inquiries and had correctly identified me as the common factor. You think you're so clever, don't you? He said, leaning back against my office wall. The quiet, methodical analyst who nobody pays attention to anymore. The perfect position to fly under the radar while you sabotage everything I've built here. There was something almost admiring in his tone, as if he was impressed by the sophistication of what he thought I had accomplished. It occurred to me that Marcus was probably more familiar with direct confrontation and obvious power plays than with subtle, long-term strategic thinking. I'm flattered that you think I'm capable of such elaborate schemes, I said, but I think you might be giving me too much credit. Maybe your clients are just naturally concerned about recent market performance. Marcus studied my face carefully, clearly trying to determine whether I was lying or whether his suspicions were misplaced. I maintained what I hoped was an expression of innocent confusion while internally calculating how much he actually knew about my activities. "Show me your phone," he demanded suddenly. The request caught me off guard, but I quickly realized what he was fishing for. He wanted to see my recent call logs and text messages to confirm his suspicions about my client communications. "Excuse me?" "Your phone, Rebecca. Show me your call history and messages from the last month. If you're not coordinating some kind of campaign against me, you shouldn't have any problem proving it." This was clearly a test, and how I responded would determine whether our confrontation escalated or whether I could defuse the situation. I knew that my phone contained nothing incriminating, since I had been careful to conduct all sensitive communications through encrypted apps and secondary devices. "Marcus, I'm not going to hand over my personal phone to you. That's completely inappropriate and probably violates company privacy policies. If you have concerns about my professional conduct, you should discuss them with human resources or senior management." My refusal seemed to confirm his suspicions rather than allay them. His expression shifted from desperate uncertainty to cold determination, and I realized that he had moved past trying to gather evidence and was now focused on neutralizing what he perceived as a threat. "Fine," he said, straightening his tie in a gesture that reminded me of his old confident persona. "But understand this, Rebecca. I know what you're doing, and I'm not going to let you destroy everything I've worked for. You want to play games? I can play games too." The threat was unmistakable, though vague enough to maintain plausible deniability if anyone else had been listening. Marcus was essentially declaring war, which meant that the careful cat-and-mouse game we had been playing was about to become much more direct and dangerous. After he left my office, I sat quietly for several minutes, processing what had just happened and adjusting my strategy accordingly. Marcus's confrontation had revealed several important pieces of information about his current state of mind and capabilities. First, he was clearly under enormous pressure from the mounting client, inquiries and audit requests. His usual smooth confidence had been replaced by desperation and anger, which suggested that his financial schemes were unraveling faster than he could manage. Second, he had correctly identified me as the source of his problems, which meant that my cover as an irrelevant, marginalized employee was blown. From now on, I would need to assume that he was actively monitoring my activities and looking for ways to retaliate. Third, and most importantly, his threat indicated that he was prepared to escalate our conflict beyond professional boundaries. The calm, calculated Marcus who had systematically destroyed my reputation was gone, replaced by someone who might be willing to take more drastic action to protect himself. I spent the rest of that morning implementing additional security measures to protect both my evidence and my personal safety. I moved my most sensitive documents to new secure locations, activated additional encryption on my communications, and began varying my daily routines to make it harder for anyone to predict my movements. But I also realized that Marcus's desperation created new opportunities for me. A calm, calculating opponent was much more dangerous than an emotional, reactive one. If I could continue to apply pressure while avoiding direct confrontation, he might make mistakes that would accelerate his own downfall. The key was to maintain my role as a passive observer rather than an active antagonist. I needed Marcus to continue believing that he was fighting against his client's natural concerns rather than my deliberate strategy. This would require even more subtlety and patience than before. Over the following weeks, I watched Marcus's behavior become increasingly erratic as he struggled to manage the cascade of problems created by his own fraudulent activities. Client meetings that used to showcase his charm and confidence now devolved into defensive explanations and desperate attempts to buy more time. I was present for one particularly revealing conference call with the trustees of a university endowment fund that Marcus had been managing for several months. The university had hired an independent auditing firm to review their portfolio after discovering discrepancies in their quarterly reports. Marcus spent the first 20 minutes of the call trying to explain why their supposedly conservative bond portfolio had lost 30% of its value during a period when government bonds had actually gained value. His explanations became increasingly convoluted as he tried to account for losses that couldn't be justified by normal market movements. "Mr. Thompson," interrupted Dr. Elizabeth Sterling, the university's chief financial officer, "we're having difficulty understanding how bonds rated 8AA by multiple agencies could have performed so poorly. Our independent analysis suggests that our money may not actually be invested in the securities described in your reports." The silence that followed was painful to witness. Marcus, who had built his reputation on his ability to talk his way out of any situation, seemed genuinely speechless. When he finally responded, his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Dr. Sterling, I understand your concerns, but you have to remember that even the highest-rated securities can be affected by broader market volatility. What might appear to be underperformance in the short term could actually position your endowment for superior long-term returns." It was the same kind of meaningless financial jargon that Marcus had always used to deflect difficult questions, but delivered without his usual confidence and charm. Even over the phone, I could hear the skepticism in Dr. Sterling's voice as she responded. "Mr. Thompson, We're not talking about short-term volatility. We're talking about fundamental discrepancies between what you told us we owned and what our independent audit says we actually own. These aren't performance issues, they're accuracy issues. The call ended with the university demanding a complete reconciliation of their account within 48 hours, along with detailed documentation of every transaction made with their money over the previous 6 months. It was exactly the kind of comprehensive review that would expose Marcus's unauthorized trading and fraudulent reporting. After the call, I watched Marcus sit in his office with his head in his hands, clearly overwhelmed by the impossibility of his situation. He couldn't produce the documentation the university was demanding because it would reveal his fraud, but he also couldn't refuse their request without confirming their suspicions. That evening, as I prepared to leave the office, I noticed that Marcus was still at his desk, surrounded by stacks of papers and multiple computer monitors. The lights in his office stayed on well past midnight, visible from the parking garage as I drove home. The next morning brought news that Marcus had requested an emergency meeting with the senior partners, claiming he needed to discuss important developments in market conditions affecting client portfolios. I knew this was probably his attempt to get ahead of the university's demands by framing the exposure of his fraud as an external market problem rather than internal misconduct. I wasn't invited to the meeting, of course, but the grim expressions on the senior partners' faces when they emerged told me everything I needed to know. Whatever explanation Marcus had attempted to provide had not been well received. James Morrison, who had been my original mentor and advocate, stopped by my office later that afternoon with the expression I couldn't quite read. He closed the door and sat down across from my desk, clearly struggling with how to begin the conversation. "Rebecca, I need to ask you about something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." I felt my pulse quicken but kept my expression neutral. "Of course, James. What can I help you with?" "Have you been encouraging clients to audit their portfolios or question their investment strategies?" It was the same accusation Marcus had made, but coming from James, it carried much more weight. James had the authority to fire me or refer my conduct for investigation, so my response needed to be both truthful and carefully calibrated. "I've maintained professional relationships with many of our long-term clients," I said slowly. "When they've asked for advice about market conditions or portfolio management, I've tried to provide helpful guidance based on my experience and expertise." James studied my face carefully, clearly trying to determine whether there was more to the story than I was revealing. "Rebecca, I've known you for 8 years. You're one of the most ethical and competent analysts I've ever worked with. But I need to understand what's been happening here." The weight of his trust and respect made this conversation much more difficult than my confrontation with Marcus. James deserved honesty, but I also needed to protect the evidence I had gathered and ensure that Marcus couldn't escape accountability through political maneuvering. "James, I think you need to look very carefully at what's been happening with client portfolios since Marcus arrived. I don't think the problems our clients are discovering are due to market conditions or performance issues." It was as close to a direct accusation as I dared to make without revealing the full scope of my investigation. I was essentially giving James permission to ask the hard questions that would expose Marcus's fraud while maintaining my position as a concerned professional rather than an active whistleblower. James leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "What exactly are you suggesting, Rebecca?" "I'm suggesting that when clients request detailed audits and their independent analysts find discrepancies between reported holdings and actual investments, that's probably not a coincidence or a clerical error." The implications of my statement hung in the air between us. James was smart enough to understand what I was suggesting without me having to spell it out explicitly. "Do you have any specific evidence of wrongdoing?" he asked. This was the moment I had been preparing for during months of careful investigation. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a thick folder containing copies of the most damaging documents I had discovered. "I think you should review these materials and draw your own conclusions," I said, handing him the folder. "All of these documents are available through our normal compliance and auditing systems. I've just organized them in a way that makes the patterns more visible." James opened the folder and began scanning the first few pages. I watched his expression change as he processed the implications of what he was seeing. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, presented in the kind of methodical, analytical format that James had always respected about my work. "My God, Rebecca, how long have you known about this?" "I've been documenting concerning patterns for several months," I replied carefully. "I wanted to be absolutely certain of my findings before raising any allegations that could damage someone's reputation or career." It was a diplomatic way of saying that I had been building an airtight case while Marcus dug his own grave deeper and deeper. James continued flipping through the documents, his expression growing darker with each page. "This is fraud, Rebecca. This isn't aggressive investing or poor judgment. This is deliberate deception and misappropriation of client funds." "I know," I said simply. "The question is what we're going to do about it." James closed the folder and looked at me with a mixture of respect and concern. "Rebecca, this evidence could destroy Marcus's career and potentially result in criminal charges. Are you prepared for the consequences of bringing this forward?" I had been asking myself the same question for months, weighing my desire for justice against the personal and professional risks of exposing such extensive fraud. But seeing the impact on innocent clients had made the decision easier. "James, there are teachers and firefighters and medical researchers who trusted us with their life savings. There are charities and foundations that depend on their investments to fund important work. Marcus has been gambling with all of that money while lying to them about what he was doing. I can't just ignore that." My response seemed to solidify something in James's mind. He stood up, tucking the folder under his arm with an expression of grim determination. "I need to discuss this with the other senior partners immediately. Rebecca, I want you to go home for the rest of the day and don't discuss this conversation with anyone. We'll need to handle this very carefully to protect both our clients and the firm's reputation." As I packed up my things to leave, I felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. After months of careful planning and patient investigation, the wheels of justice were finally beginning to turn, but I also knew that Marcus wouldn't go down without a fight, and the next few days would determine whether my strategy had been successful or whether I had merely set myself up for retaliation. The drive home felt surreal, like the calm before, a storm that I had been preparing for but couldn't fully control. I had set events in motion that would soon expose Marcus's crimes and protect his victims, but I had also made myself a target for whatever desperate measures he might attempt as his world collapsed around him. That evening, I sat in my apartment, reviewing the security measures I had put in place and mentally preparing for whatever Marcus might try to do, when he realized that his carefully constructed empire of lies was about to come crashing down. I had spent months digging his financial grave, and tomorrow he would finally discover just how deep I had made it. The emergency board meeting was called for 8 o'clock the following morning, and I knew my life was about to change forever. I arrived at the office early, watching through my window as black sedans deposited serious-looking men and women in expensive suits at the building's entrance. These weren't just Meridian financial partners. They were federal investigators, regulatory officials, and forensic accountants who specialized in financial crimes. Marcus arrived 20 minutes late, his usually pristine appearance replaced by a disheveled desperation that was visible even from my office across the hall. His tie was crooked, his shirt wrinkled, and his signature confidence had evaporated entirely. When he walked past my door, he didn't even glance in my direction, but I could see the defeat in his shoulders. James Morrison appeared in my doorway. At exactly 9:15, his expression grave but determined. "Rebecca, We need you in conference room A. Bring everything." I gathered the additional documentation I had prepared overnight, knowing this would be my only opportunity to present the complete scope of Marcus's fraud to people who had the power to take meaningful action. The elevator. Ride to the executive floor felt like ascending to Judgment Day, though I wasn't sure whether I was the prosecutor, witness, or defendant. Conference room A was packed with more people than I had ever seen in a Meridian financial meeting. At the head of the table sat Margaret Aldrich, the chairwoman of our board of directors, flanked by federal agents and SEC investigators. Marcus sat alone on one side of the table, his legal counsel whispering urgently in his ear. The remaining seats were filled with senior partners, compliance officers, and external auditors. "Ms. Chen," Margaret Aldrich said as I entered, "please take a seat. We understand you have information relevant to our investigation." The next 3 hours were the most intense of my professional life. I presented my evidence methodically, walking through months of documentation that revealed the systematic nature of Marcus's fraud. Every question was answered with precise detail, every accusation supported by irrefutable proof. I explained how Marcus had created a sophisticated system of false reporting that made unauthorized high-risk investments appear to be conservative, diversified portfolios. I demonstrated how he had manipulated compliance systems to hide his activities from internal auditors. I detailed the specific impact on individual clients, showing how teachers' retirement funds had been gambled away while they received reports, showing steady growth. The federal investigators took copious notes, occasionally asking for clarification or requesting additional documentation. Marcus's attorney tried several times to object or challenge my testimony, but the evidence was too comprehensive and well-documented to dispute. The most devastating moment came when I presented the analysis showing that Marcus's unauthorized activities had put over $200 million in client assets at risk. The room fell completely silent as the magnitude of his fraud became clear to everyone present. "Mr. Thompson," Margaret Aldrich said finally, turning to face Marcus directly, "do you dispute any of the evidence Ms. Chen has presented?" Marcus looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 3 hours. His famous charm was nowhere to be found, replaced by the hollow expression of someone who knew their world was ending. He began, then stopped. His attorney whispered something urgent in his ear, but Marcus shook his head. "I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination." It was the admission of guilt that everyone in the room had been waiting for. If Marcus had been innocent, he would have defended himself vigorously. Instead, he was essentially confessing by refusing to testify. The meeting continued for another hour as investigators outlined the next steps in their criminal investigation. Marcus would be arrested within days, charged with multiple counts of securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. Meridian Financial would face massive fines and regulatory sanctions, but my cooperation and documentation had given them a chance to demonstrate good faith efforts to address the fraud. As the meeting concluded, Marcus finally looked directly at me for the first time since I had begun my testimony. The hatred in his eyes was unmistakable, but it was tempered by something else, a grudging respect for the thoroughness of my revenge. "You really did bury me," he said quietly as investigators escorted him from the room. "I underestimated you completely." I watched him walk away, feeling none of the satisfaction I had expected. The man who had tried to destroy my career was now facing decades in federal prison, his reputation shattered beyond repair, his financial future reduced to ashes. But seeing his defeat up close, I realized that revenge was more complex and less fulfilling than I had anticipated. The weeks following Marcus's arrest were a whirlwind of media attention, client meetings, and regulatory proceedings. The story of his massive fraud made national headlines, with reporters describing it as one of the most sophisticated investment scams in recent history. My role as the whistleblower who exposed the fraud made me something of a celebrity in financial circles, though I tried to avoid most interview requests. The most rewarding part was meeting with the clients whose money I had helped recover. Dr. Yamamoto's Medical Research Foundation was able to resume their critical work thanks to the rapid recovery of their funds. The Hartwell Pension Fund avoided catastrophic losses that would have devastated thousands of retirees. University endowments, charitable foundations, and individual investors all expressed their gratitude for my decision to speak up, despite the personal and professional risks. But the consequences for Meridian Financial were severe. The firm paid over $100 million in fines and restitution to affected clients. Several senior partners were forced to resign due to their failure to detect Marcus's activities. The company's reputation was permanently damaged, leading to a significant loss of business and eventual acquisition by a larger firm. I found myself in an unexpected position of influence and respect within the industry. Job offers poured in from competing firms who wanted to hire the analyst who had single-handedly exposed one of the decade's biggest financial frauds. Regulatory agencies sought my input on improving detection systems for investment fraud. Academic institutions invited me to speak about corporate ethics and whistleblower protection. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus's attempt to destroy my career had actually elevated me to a level of professional recognition I never could have achieved through normal career advancement. By trying to bury me, he had inadvertently created the perfect conditions for my resurrection and transformation into one of the industry's most respected voices on financial integrity. 6 months after Marcus's conviction, I sat in my new office as Chief Ethics Officer at Sterling Investment Management, a boutique firm that specialized in serving institutional clients with conservative investment needs. My job was to ensure that no client would ever experience what Marcus's victims had endured, and I took that responsibility seriously. The view from my new office overlooked Boston Harbor, and I often found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. Marcus had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to his victims. His assets had been seized, his professional licenses revoked, and his name had become synonymous with investment fraud in industry publications. But more importantly, the reforms I had helped implement were protecting countless investors from similar schemes. New compliance systems, enhanced reporting requirements, and stronger regulatory oversight meant that future Marcus Thompsons would find it much harder to exploit client trust for personal gain. I received a letter from Marcus about a year after his sentencing. It was handwritten on prison letterhead, and his once confident script now appeared shaky and uncertain. "Rebecca," it began, "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, and I'm not seeking it. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what I destroyed. Not just my own life and career, but the financial security of people who trusted me with their futures. You were right to stop me, and I was wrong to try to destroy you when you represented everything I should have aspired to be." The letter continued for several pages, describing his gradual understanding of the real impact of his crimes and his attempts to make amends through prison financial literacy programs. It concluded with an acknowledgement that seemed genuine in its humility. "You said I was burying your career, but I was actually burying my own soul. You helped me find it again, even if it was too late to matter. I hope the changes you've helped implement will prevent others from following my path." I read the letter several times, trying to reconcile this introspective, remorseful man with the arrogant manipulator who had tried to destroy my life. Perhaps prison had given him the perspective and humility that his previous success had prevented him from developing. I never responded to Marcus's letter, but I kept it as a reminder of how dramatically people's lives can change when they're forced to confront the consequences of their actions. The man who had once declared that I was already in my grave had discovered that he was the one who had been spiritually dead, while I had emerged from our conflict more alive and purposeful than ever. 5 years later, I was invited to speak at a conference on corporate ethics and whistleblower protection. The audience was filled with compliance officers, regulatory officials, and financial professionals who were working to create a more ethical and transparent industry. During the question and answer session, a young analyst asked me about the personal cost of exposing financial fraud and whether I had any regrets about the path I had chosen. I thought about Marcus, now serving the 8th year of his prison sentence. I thought about the clients whose retirement savings had been recovered and the reforms that had prevented similar frauds. I thought about my own journey from a marginalized employee to a respected industry leader. The cost of speaking truth to power is often high, I said finally, but the cost of remaining silent when innocent people are being harmed is always higher. Marcus Thompson tried to convince me that my career was already dead, but he was wrong. What was dead was my willingness to accept injustice and corruption as the price of professional advancement. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause, but I wasn't finished. The most important lesson I learned is that sometimes you have to be willing to lose everything you think you want in order to discover who you really are. Marcus thought he was burying my future, but he was actually excavating my purpose. After the conference, I drove back to my office thinking about the strange twists of fate that had led me to this point. Marcus had set out to destroy me because he saw me as an obstacle to his fraudulent empire. Instead, he had created his greatest enemy, and ultimately, his own destroyer. The financial grave he thought he was digging for me had become his own burial site. While I had risen from the ashes of my destroyed career to become someone far more powerful and influential than I ever could have imagined. As I sat in my office that evening, watching the sun set over Boston Harbor, I realized that Marcus had given me an unexpected gift. By trying to bury me, he had forced me to discover depths of strength, intelligence, and determination that I never knew I possessed. He had unwittingly transformed me from a competent analyst into a formidable force for justice. The irony was perfect and complete. Marcus Thompson had declared that I was already in my grave, but instead of burying me, he had buried his own financial future 6 feet under while inadvertently resurrecting mine. In trying to be my executioner, he had become my creator, shaping me into exactly the kind of person who could ensure his complete and permanent destruction. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't what you do to your enemies, but what they do to themselves when they underestimate who you really are. The unexpected phone call came on a Tuesday morning 3 years after my conference speech, interrupting my review of quarterly compliance reports. My assistant's voice carried an unusual tension as she announced the caller. "Rebecca, there's someone on line 2 who says he's calling on behalf of Marcus Thompson. He claims it's urgent." I felt my pulse quicken at the mention of that name. Marcus had been released from federal prison 6 months earlier after serving 10 years of his 15-year sentence, earning early release for good behavior and his work establishing financial literacy programs for other inmates. I had followed his case through industry publications, noting his apparent transformation from arrogant fraudster to repentant advocate for prison reform. "Transfer the call to my office," I said, curious despite myself about what Marcus could possibly want after all these years. The voice that came through my speakerphone was unfamiliar at first, weathered and humble in a way that Marcus Thompson had never been. "Rebecca, this is Marcus. I know you have every right to hang up on me, but I'm hoping you'll give me 5 minutes to explain why I'm calling." I leaned back in my chair, studying the city skyline through my window while processing the surreal experience of hearing from the man whose life I had systematically destroyed. "You have my attention, Marcus. What do you want?" "I'm calling because I need your help, and I know how insane that must sound coming from me." His voice carried a self-awareness that the old Marcus had never possessed. "But there's something happening that I think you need to know about. Something that could affect everything you've built since our conflict." The hesitation in his voice suggested he was struggling to find appropriate words for what had transpired between us. I appreciated his acknowledgement that our relationship couldn't be reduced to simple professional disagreement. "I'm listening," I said neutrally, though my mind was already racing through possibilities. What could Marcus possibly know that would be relevant to my current position? There's a new player in the Boston financial scene, someone who's been asking questions about you and studying your methods for exposing financial fraud. His name is David Castellanos, and he's building something that looks suspiciously like the operation I used to run, except much more sophisticated. The name was unfamiliar to me, but the implications of Marcus's warning were immediately concerning. What kind of questions has he been asking? Detailed questions about your investigation, techniques, your client relationships, your methods for gathering evidence. He's been presenting himself as an academic researcher studying corporate whistleblowing, but his interest seems much more personal and specific than scholarly curiosity would justify. I felt a chill of recognition. Someone was potentially targeting me the way I had once targeted Marcus, studying my methods to either replicate them or defend against them. How do you know about this, Marcus? And why would you warn me? Because I've been working with a nonprofit organization that helps former white-collar criminals reintegrate into society, and Castellanos approached us claiming he wanted to interview reformed financial fraudsters for his research. During my interview with him, he spent most of the time asking about you rather than me. There was a pause as Marcus seemed to gather his thoughts before continuing. Rebecca, I know what it looks like when someone is planning something destructive. I recognize the obsessive attention to detail, the careful gathering of information, the strategic thinking about weaknesses and vulnerabilities. This guy is studying you the same way you studied me. The irony of receiving a warning from my former enemy about a potential new threat was almost overwhelming. What exactly did he ask you about me? Everything. Your background, your personality, your professional relationships, your methods for building cases against financial criminals. He wanted to know about your security practices, your daily routines, even your personal life. He claimed it was for a case study about successful whistleblowers, but his questions were too specific and too focused for academic research. I began taking notes as Marcus continued, my professional instincts overriding my personal feelings about the source of this information. Did he mention what kind of organization he works for or what his ultimate goals might be? He claimed to be affiliated with Harvard Business School, but when I tried to verify his credentials later, I couldn't find any record of him in their faculty directory. His business cards and documentation looked legitimate, but something felt wrong about the whole interaction. This was becoming increasingly concerning. Someone was using sophisticated deception to gather intelligence about me, potentially for hostile purposes. Marcus, I need you to tell me everything you can remember about this conversation, every detail that seemed unusual or suspicious. For the next 20 minutes, Marcus provided a comprehensive briefing about his encounter with David Castellanos, demonstrating the kind of analytical thinking that had once made him such a dangerous adversary. Despite everything that had happened between us, I found myself grateful for his attention to detail and his obvious concern for my welfare. There's something else, Marcus said as our conversation was winding down. Castellanos mentioned that he was particularly interested in understanding how someone could rebuild their career after destroying a powerful enemy. He seemed to think your success after exposing my fraud was somehow unnatural or suspicious. This revelation added a new dimension to my concerns. It suggested that Castellanos might not just be studying my methods, but questioning the legitimacy of my post-scandal success. Did he express any theories about why my career recovered so dramatically? He implied that there might have been external forces helping you, that your transformation from marginalized employee to industry leader happened too quickly and too completely to be purely organic. He seemed to think someone with significant influence had intervened on your behalf. I felt a surge of indignation at the suggestion that my achievements had been manufactured or manipulated. Every opportunity I had received after exposing Marcus's fraud had been earned through demonstrated competence and ethical leadership. That's completely false, Marcus. Nobody intervened on my behalf. Everything I've accomplished has been based on merit and hard work. I know that, Marcus replied quickly. But Castellanos seemed convinced that there was more to your story than public records revealed. He talked about conducting a comprehensive investigation to uncover what he called the real truth about your rapid ascent in the industry. This conversation continued for another 10 minutes as we discussed potential motivations for Castellanos' interest in my background and methods. Marcus suggested several possibilities, ranging from academic research to corporate espionage to personal vendetta, but none of them provided a completely satisfactory explanation for the intensity and specificity of his inquiries. As we prepared to end the call, Marcus made an offer that surprised me. Rebecca, I know I have no right to ask anything of you after what I put you through, but if this Castellanos character is planning something against you, I'd like to help you prepare for it. I understand better than anyone how dangerous a determined enemy can be. I considered his offer carefully, weighing the potential benefits of his assistance against the complications of accepting help from someone whose life I had systematically destroyed. Why would you want to help me, Marcus, after everything that happened between us? Because you were right to stop me, and because I owe you a debt that I can never fully repay. You saved my clients from even greater losses, and you probably saved me from committing even worse crimes. If someone is planning to attack you the way I once did, then stopping them is the least I can do to balance the scales. His sincerity seemed genuine, but I remained cautious about accepting assistance from someone with such a complex relationship to my past. Let me think about it, Marcus. I appreciate the warning, and I'll certainly investigate this Castellanos situation further. Of course. But Rebecca, please don't underestimate this threat. If someone is using my story as a template for attacking you, they've learned from my mistakes and will probably be much more careful about covering their tracks. After ending the call, I sat in my office for a long time, processing the implications of what Marcus had told me. The possibility that someone was systematically studying my methods and background for potentially hostile purposes required immediate attention and careful strategic planning. I spent the rest of that day implementing enhanced security measures and beginning my own investigation into David Castellanos. Within hours, I had confirmed Marcus's suspicions about his academic credentials. No one by that name was affiliated with Harvard Business School or any other major university. The business cards and documentation he had used were sophisticated forgeries. Over the following weeks, I discovered that Castellanos had been conducting similar interviews with other people connected to high-profile financial fraud cases. He had spoken with former SEC investigators, compliance officers, and other whistleblowers, always using the same cover story about academic research while gathering detailed intelligence about fraud detection and investigation methods. The pattern suggested that someone was conducting a comprehensive study of financial crime enforcement with the goal of developing countermeasures or launching sophisticated attacks. The focus on my background and methods indicated that I was likely a specific target rather than just one subject among many. As I deepened my investigation, I began to uncover connections between Castellanos and several offshore investment firms that specialized in high-risk, minimally regulated financial products. These firms operated in legal gray areas, using complex, international structures to avoid oversight while generating enormous profits for their operators. The more I learned about this network of companies, the more I understood why they might view me as a threat. My work at Sterling Investment Management had contributed to regulatory reforms that made their business model more difficult and expensive to operate. My public advocacy for enhanced financial oversight and stronger whistleblower protections directly threatened their ability to exploit regulatory gaps. This realization transformed my understanding of the situation from personal vendetta to professional warfare. I wasn't just dealing with one individual who had targeted me for unknown reasons. I was confronting a sophisticated operation designed to neutralize threats to a lucrative but ethically questionable industry. The irony was remarkable. just as Marcus had once tried to destroy me because I represented an obstacle to his fraudulent schemes. This new network was targeting me because my success had made me a symbol of effective resistance to financial corruption. They had studied Marcus's failure and were now attempting to succeed where he had failed, but they had made the same fundamental mistake that Marcus had made. They underestimated both my capabilities and my determination. The experience of defeating Marcus had taught me lessons about strategic thinking, evidence gathering, and coalition. Building that made me far more formidable than they realized. As I prepared to confront this new threat, I found myself thinking about the strange journey that had brought me to this point. Marcus's attempt to bury my career had transformed me into exactly the kind of person who could identify and defeat sophisticated attacks on financial integrity. His legacy, ironically, was my strength. The battle ahead would be different from my conflict with Marcus, requiring new strategies and different allies. But the core principles remained the same: careful investigation, meticulous documentation, and patient strategic planning would ultimately triumph over deception and manipulation. David Castellanos and his network had chosen the wrong enemy. They thought they were targeting a successful analyst who had gotten lucky once. Instead, they were about to discover that Marcus Thompson's greatest mistake had been creating his own destroyer, and that destroyer was now ready to protect everything she had built from anyone foolish enough to challenge it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.